Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Vivian Benish, Producing Artistic Director at PlayMakers Repertory Company.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Josmell Perez. I'm the Director of the Carolina Latinx Center.
And we are thrilled to welcome you to this very unique conversation with some of the amazing artists involved in PlayMakers' current production of Karen Zacarías' brilliant and hilarious play, Native Gardens. For this production, PlayMakers was excited to deepen our relationship with some of UNC's wonderful cultural centers, including the Carolina Latinx Center, as well as the American Indian Center and North Carolina Botanical Gardens. Our conversation today was inspired by this collaboration, and I am so grateful to all of our partners for their interest in using Karen's amazing play as a springboard to important conversation. I also want to offer my deepest thanks to all the artists that you're about to meet, but in particular to Karen for making time to join us virtually and share with us a bit about her journey around this play, its many themes, as well as her work as a Latinx artist. A tiny bit of housekeeping. For those of you joining one of our virtual conversations for the first time, you'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That is a great tool to write in any questions that you might have. You can do this at any point during the conversation. It won't interrupt us. Our fabulous producing associate, Chelsea James, will be keeping an eye on the chat and passing those questions along to us. Josmell.
It is now my pleasure to introduce Talitha. Talitha is a student here at Carolina. They also serve as the assistant director of the play. And really, they were the reason why we were all able to come together. I am so proud of their work and commitment to not only the Latinx community, but to the art world as a whole.
Talitha, join us and take it away.
Thank you so much, Vivian and Josmell. Yes, I'm Talitha Moniz McMillion, the Assistant Director and Ambassador for the Latino Studies Program. I am excited to be the moderator for this conversation as well as a panelist, so I'll probably jump in with my own thoughts on a few questions. But first, I'd like to introduce the rest of our panelists. First, we have the wonderful actress playing Tanya, Sarita Ocón, our wonderful Pablo, Alejandro Rodriguez, our wonderful director, Patrick Torres, and of course, the playwright of Native Gardens, Karen Zacarías. Thank you so much for being here with us. And there will be bios for all of the panelists posted in the chat for you to read more about us. But yes, thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited to discuss this play. I think first, we can start off by talking about our experiences with this production. And Karen, I think we'd really love to hear your experiences with the productions you've seen of your play throughout the country and how that's been received in different communities.
Well, I'd like to hear first from everybody else, and then I'll do the...
Definitely, yeah. So yeah, our director, our actors, would you like to speak on our production?
Who's jumping in? I'll jump in. This production's been near and dear to my heart for a long time. Karen founded a company called Young Playwrights Theater, which was my first salaried job ever in my life when I was in DC. And so I got to know Karen really well then, and have always been a fan of your work, Karen. And this play, I think, is so resonant on so many levels. For me, I'm a mixed race Latin male. That's how I identify. And I have lived in spaces for most of my personal life, and even in my career in predominantly white spaces. And the journey, the social ideas and themes of the play that get wrestled with have always been so resonant for me as a human being. I feel like many times the war that happens across the fence in the play happens internally for me as I try to figure out my place in the world. And I just really value so much getting to play in that world and put that journey on stage. And I think our production just has such a stellar cast, and the conversations that we got into were so meaningful and so personal and so great. And I think that heart that existed in all those conversations shows up on stage, and it makes me very proud. But I'll turn it over to Sarita and Alejandro to add to that.
I mean, it's just been an incredible experience. I've been a fan of Karen's work for so long, and have also had the opportunity to work with her before. And so, but Native Gardens in particular, as a first generation daughter of immigrants, Mexican American, there's so many themes that resonate throughout the course of the journey. And Tanya in particular, just her essence, her strength, her determination, and just kind of a resiliency, and then also the shortcomings as well. But there's just such a moment of intelligence that I just am really, it's lovely to step into a character while I embrace all our stories of our diaspora. It's actually really lovely to step into somebody who's just so rooted in a kind of intelligence and strength. So that's always, it's an honor to finally be able to have the opportunity to breathe some life into the character. So it's been an awesome experience.
Yes, to all of what's been said, I guess I'll just say that if you are a Latinx theater artist in this country, you have probably been impacted by Karen Zacarías, probably in more than one way. I in addition to getting to work on this play, I got to participate in the Encuentro Festival that she put together several years ago, which was a gathering of Latino artists all around the country and beyond, actually. I mean, so many of my community, so many members of my community have just looked up to you, Karen, and have been in the wake of the work that you do on so many different fronts. What Sarita says is true for me. Getting to work like on a rising attorney, Chilean attorney, married to a brilliant doctoral candidate. Is unfortunately too rare a blessing as a Hispanic American and a theater artist. Is just, it's nice to get to play up to your intelligence, and Karen gives us that opportunity to do that. And I'll just add to what Patrick said, the conversations that were happening in the rehearsal room now I'm learning they feel like every audience joins us in that conversation. And what I'm learning being up there every night is that through the oohs and the ahs and the applause and the laughter, we hear how the debate and how the conversation is being reflected and echoed and wrestled with. We can hear it every night. So to have Chapel Hill and the Triangle join us in that really rich and charged and powerful conversation that Karen put on the paper is like, it's been such a ride. So, yeah.
Thank you all. And I just want to say to the conversations we had, there were some about the differences in when we came across this play before the pandemic and now 2 years later, looking at it again. So that's been interesting. And also doing it in a predominantly white area has been an interesting experience, and I think a necessary one. So, throughout the conversation, Sarita, I know you had some really amazing insights during rehearsals about, not to put you on the spot, but if you want to share throughout our conversations, I think you had a lot of wonderful insights about that.
Do you anything in particular, like a seedling?
Yeah, you were talking about, I'm thinking about the day you were talking about when you realized how plausible something like this could be, just because of how charged everything is right now.
Yeah, I do now remember. It was so, I have so many friends that have been able to touch this play over the course of the last couple of years. And I remember Karen, when y'all premiered it in 2016, and I was just following its journey and got a hold of it in 2017 and remembered introducing it to PlayMakers and to Vivian. And, you're reading it and I'm like, okay, wow, this is it's there's a lot of charge. There's a lot of there's an energy being exchanged between these two couples, these two neighbors, and sometimes it felt really big. And then over the course of our recent years and collective experience of the pandemic, and even some of the, kind of the tension, racial tension that our country is experiencing at the moment, suddenly in 2022, it feels more like, oh, we're in such an amplified time, given just all the trauma we have collectively experienced, that it feels like there's an electricity, there's a tense vibration that's kind of crackling at the surface. And so now it's almost as though I was like, was Karen seeing into the future? This was coming, because the relationships are just, it's like they just pop back and forth. And so I feel like we're living in that moment, in that space and time. And so for whatever reason, in 2022, the play just drops so much more deeper, so much more layered, to what Ale talked about in terms of the audience now being part of the journey with us. I'm fascinated in that we're all kind of having this conversation together, because we're all hearing each other in very new ways. The responses to both sides, the kind of raw vulnerability, the aspects of our humanity that are very raw and reveal more to what we're all enduring in the moment, and yet the learning and the growth that can come out on the other side as well. So I don't know, reading it back in 2017 but doing it in 2022, this time feels like it's lending itself to something even more deeper than I could have ever imagined.
Has the audience spoken back to the play? Do people say things out loud? Because that's something I found in every production.
Oh, wow. Sarita?
I at the
Like
moment, there's a
oohs
lot
or
of like
ahs, or
oohs and ahs for sure.
or when Frank keeps saying he about the attorney. Has anyone from the audience said she? Because
Oh, the audience, the one that seems very like, oh no, is when Frank goes, you need to chop down that tree. And you can hear like, no, or like, oh, like they already know, like, oh, trouble's coming. Or sometimes I've heard on our side of del Valle side of the audience, when we're measuring out and Pablo steps over into the other yard, I can hear people going, oh dear. Like I can hear those audible responses of like the realization of what's about to ensue a little bit. So definitely in those first early couple of scenes and a lot of oohs and ahs. Ale, have you heard other?
2.5 years, y'all. Never gonna get that right. It hasn't been quite yet expressed in like language in the course of the play, but the immigrant plants versus colonialists gets a big response. Last night in the house, Patrick, you would enjoy this. Somebody in the curtain call, we've gotten warm applause, but somebody got up and just gave us a fist pump. Yeah, like we're with you, and in the lobby, after the show, certainly we've heard some. We really needed this. And I could only guess at all the various ways they might have meant that, needed a good laugh, needed to be in a space and share this important and difficult conversation, needed to be in live theater again. I mean, I could only imagine all the ways they meant it, but yeah, so far that's what we've heard.
Vivian just said in the chat, reminding us on opening night when Tanya's biodiversity speech got like a huge round of applause, which was incredible, right in the middle of the scene. And we just, waited for that. That was really wonderful.
I guess that's what I love about this play that keeps surprising me, is that because it's a comedy and no one comes out smelling like a rose in some ways, you know, because they're all human and they're all trying. I do love that about all four of the characters. They all try, nobody gives up on each other, because you can't give up on your neighbor. You can't be enemies with your neighbor for the rest of your life, because it will age you. It will do bad things to you. So I love that you were asking earlier, like what other productions. One thing that the production has had, whether it's been done in Nebraska or Georgia or Chicago or DC or, you know, Cincinnati, is that it elicits a response from the audience, whether it's laughter or oohs or something like that. And I love the idea. I've always wanted theater to feel, for the audience to feel alive in a show. And we've been taught for so long to be such, you know, prim and proper audience members that we hold everything inside. And there's something about comedy that's literally disarming. And because I was hoping that the play picked on everybody in different ways. And you know, you can feel different people identify with who's in their camp, and it's not always the people you think it would be. But I've always been very intrigued. When I go watch the play, I always go admire the beautiful direction and set design. Gosh, the set is gorgeous for this production. And watch the actors, and I'm always surprised by what the landscapers. Every production has something different with the landscapers, which is always so exciting for me. But the other part I really watch, sometimes I always ask to be put in the back, is I watch the audience. Because the audience is a part of the play. And I love what you were saying, Alejandro, about this is true with every play, but this one in particular, there's a very animated dialogue going on between the actors on stage and the audience. And so that's why I'm always intrigued when people actually let noise come out of their body, you know, or not, right? So I just, that makes me just happy, yeah, in whichever way.
That's really wonderful, thank you. And I have found myself watching the audience as well, and specifically with the landscapers, because you brought them up. And this is a conversation Patrick and I had at one point, was just how we thought the audience in this particular area would connect with the landscapers. Would they view them as simply laborers, or identify them with them the way that so many Latinx people can, because we've worked these jobs. And so, yeah, I mean, I wonder if in other areas you see a different connection to this, or if it's performed for a Latinx audience, for example.
Well, I've seen all sorts of audience see it. I think what happens is there's a lot of talking between the two sides, but the people doing all the work and literally changing the landscape of this country are the workers, right? And so the two couples are doing other kind of work, right? But what I don't know, I never know if this was kind of my subversive idea, like there's, you know, the scene changes are happening with the people who are actually changing. And they talk a lot about landscaping and who belongs and who's there and where's the border there. But the landscapers are literally the ones doing all the heavy lifting, in a sense, when it comes to scene changes and all of that. And whether people start to realize that or not, but that's true behind the scenes, that's true behind restaurants, that's true in other places. So even though there's no lines played, it was a very deliberate, the people without voice are doing a lot of the decision-making is being made by other people, but the work is being done by the laborers, in a sense. So that was a very purposeful kind of way to, an exciting way to deal with how the set isn't a character, so how the changing of the set adds pressure to the situation on you know, on this very ill-conceived party that must happen because poor Pablo has been put in a position where he has to prove himself, right? So, you know, everything's heightened about it. It's a comedy. And yet, Sarita, I really appreciate what you were saying about everyone's heightened right now, right? Everything is so heightened.
Mm-hmm. That's really beautiful. Thank you. And I think this would be a good place to also talk about the idea of borders and what, of course, the fence is representing. And to me, there's a lot of themes about the indigeneity of many Latin American people. And so I would love to hear any thoughts, both from you, Karen, and all of our panelists about what that means to you all and this choice of reclamation and being detribalized and having to figure out an identity now, a new language for identity. And I love thinking about Pablo's line, "We own more than we think," because to me, that's a realization that a lot of Latin American people are going through now. So yeah, feel free to, and I see that we have a question in the chat, but we can tackle that one.
Well, I'll just start, my answer is really a reflection, in that one of the other things that feels like a rare blessing is to get to step into the complexity of the conversation around the Latinx experience and what ancestry and what identity, the broad and diverse and complex spectrum of, I actually hesitate to say Latinidad because I feel like that's a term that is elusive even to me, and it feels very much like a construct. I feel like would need to contextualize that if I use that word further, but I play somebody from a wealthy background in Chile, and I've imagined that Pablo has mostly European ancestry, although depending on how long his family has been in Latin America, it's hard to believe that he would have emerged with just specifically European. It probably got mezclado as so much of the families over the course of generations in Latin America have. So it's in this country, in the US, I feel like it can sometimes be a fairly simplified conversation. Oh, you are Latinx, you check that box. But in my experience, and in the experience of a lot of folks of that identity in this country, it's far more complex than that, and how they locate their own indigeneity versus their own colonial, the parts of their background that are from Europe, and that got mixed in while their families were here in this country, is really complex. And the fact that in Karen's play, in a very couple, we have that spectrum, because Tanya says in the play, my family has been in their land for over 200 years, and who knows how much beyond that. And so I've always associated the fact that she wants to have this native garden with the fact that she is leading Pablo in his own exploration of what that means for him. And it's not something I think he grew up with access or conversant in, but she does. She's connected to the land. Her family has been connected to the land. And I think that's true. There's those of us exist on a spectrum of our understanding of that. And I consider myself very much in a learning place, like a student of that in terms of my own background and identity. So.
Thank you, Alejandro. And that's great too when we think about in our process finding new or old identity, when it works for us and when it doesn't too. That's something that a lot of Latinx people have to analyze. Just like Pablo's, I love the law and then I hate the law, you know? So when does that come up in identity, and which ones serve you, you know? So it's just a lot of things, but I think this play naturally leads into a conversation about indigeneity and land back and the ancestral ties like you said, specifically through Tanya, who's an interesting character because, well, she says, like you said, her family has been here for over 200 years, but she never uses the term indigenous to describe herself, which is an interesting choice as well. And wants to study borders, but where does that border apply when she says that Pablo is a foreigner, for example? So, and I think many Latinx people have very different ideas of when those borders come up and when they don't. Thank you. And Patrick, Sarita, and Karen, feel free if you have thoughts, or we can go on to some questions that we're getting as well.
I mean, I'm so intrigued by that conversation. And I think that one of the things that I love so much about the play is just the conversation that it's even in the prologue epilogue. I think there's something so true about the play that kind of dives, to me, for the heart of what I find so amazing about the play is it's just the switched dialogue that ends the prologue and epilogue. That, you know, the Butleys in the first one say old neighborhood, and the Davalle say new neighbors, and then that language switches for the epilogue. And that is such indicative of a journey that's happened, of a recognition of this move towards each other, this new understanding of each other. And I know that this is getting off your question a little bit, Talitha, but I'm going back because I've been stuck on it since Karen and Alejandro were talking about these oohs and ahs and the kind of conversations that's happening with the audience. And I'm so, one of the reasons I love the theater is because it requires us to be in the same room, breathe the same air, and we can be affected by one another's breath. And I feel like breath is so central to this play. The reconciliation at the end happens because we breathe together for the first time. And I feel like the breath that is happening in the audience that is connected to these characters is part of the great subversion, I think, of using comedy to tell this story. And I think that there is something in that to kind of get back to your question that is related about these lines that we draw around each other, around ourselves, and how those lines can be dismantled. And I've talked a lot about in the rehearsal process and throughout about how much I love the image of the tree and how the tree stands over this yard as the original occupant, actually, that we are all having these disputes in and under the natural world that governs that maybe we should look to help us govern some of these disputes. You know what I mean? Like the tree had been there long before this neighborhood, and the tree will last, if it doesn't get cut down, long after this dispute is over. And so how do we look to nature to kind of to teach us about the size and scope of these arguments and how we identify with the people that surround us. I don't know, that was off your question a little bit, but it's just what I was thinking about.
I think that's beautiful. Thank you, Patrick. I think that's really beautiful. And I think, first of all, can I just say that it shows through in your production of this play, your emphasis on the tree, and it's very beautiful. So I think that's maybe varies between directors. So a big acknowledgement for your work in highlighting that. And you mentioned the idea of lines, which is something we're talking about. And it's interesting because we still do end up with a line in the yard, right? It's prettier than a fence maybe, but it's still there, which is interesting. And the fact that it's a Virginia sweet spire, which is, I think, very clever. So yeah, Karen, if you have any input on your decision for that, I think we'd all love to hear it.
Well, I mean, I was doing this at Victory Gardens, second production of this, and at the point they built another fence that is an earlier draft. And it was Che Yu goes, why is there a fence? And I was like, oh, you're right. Why is there? I mean, this is what's great about seeing a new production. The play keeps teaching me, right? Like where I have my blind spots and where the things are. There's like, oh, yeah, what if we created, plants, a native plant that gets planted between both neighbors. And you raise a good question. Why should there be, a border between the two neighbors? And I think still where we are still as a capitalist, society that is obsessed with owning property and using it as a way of moving forward, et cetera. It was a more realistic way of being able to give a next step forward, is the idea of not putting up a wood fence where you don't see each other, but the idea of still having some privacy, but still being still being able to look over and be aware that, respecting each other's space and each other's air. It'd be very interesting if in another incantation of the play, if we okay, we can, I do know of friends who have like all of their backyards connected and the dogs and the kids run through that, which would be a really wonderful, idyllic thing, unless my dog runs away. But what this play keeps teaching me, and I'm finding here, there's a comment here about Viva la Raza, that someone has brought up, that when I wrote it, it was very, this is the question. I loved the play last night, but I was wondering if we could expand on the Viva la Raza comment, because as a Latino, it is definitely statement holds an anti-Indigenous and anti-Black sentiments. And I was like, well, the word definitely is, I would say that's not true for when I was growing up. Viva la Raza was actually in Mexico about owning your mestizaje and your indigenous point of view and part of the Chicano, and it has evolved and changed in different ways. So I'm very intrigued and interested by this comment that that further reflection and how language changes and how it reflects different things at a different time. But when I wrote it, it was actually, in my mind, and I'm happy to get this education and this different point of view, about a person owning part of, their indigenous culture, because, in the Chicano movement in the 60s and 70s, that was a cry forward. We all know that the Latino community is really diverse and has exhibited an anti-Blackness, sometimes an anti-Indigenous, even though we come from a very mixed background. So even so, something that I wrote from a point of view of growing up and seeing activists saying these words, learning that it might have a double meaning is really exciting to learn that from the audience at this point, but I did not know that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is really interesting how language changes. And again, and that is interesting because I do think this particular line has been a topic of conversation amongst my peers. And so to hear that it was different at a different time is interesting, and also speaks to, again, how we're trying to navigate finding our identity with the colonized language and that we're left with. And yeah, thank you so much for touching on that. And I wonder if you...
I see this right now. Did Karen think of including any more dialogue about the whole Latino, Latina, Latinx vocabulary? I grew up with folks who use Chicano, Chicana, and definitely don't use Latinx. Well, this play was written in 2016, and we had started something called the Latino, Latina Theater Commons. And we at that time in the we started this in 2012, and at the time Latino Latina was what was used, and what was then proposed as a group, whatever, to include our trans brothers and sisters is taking away the O and A and adding the X. And so in our groups, that was a way of acknowledging. Now it's become Latin, and now, so this is what's interesting about a play that's written at a certain moment in time, what it holds with it, and do I keep changing it? Does it keep changing? I did not grow up considering myself a Chicano or Chicana because I actually grew up in Mexico and I moved to the States. So I will always consider myself a Mexicana. And so, you know, even within different places, and I have friends who consider themselves Chicanos. I have friends who consider, you know, Sarita, what did you grow up considering yourself?
So what's fascinating is, as a first generation Mexican American, my parents, whom they immigrated from Chihuahua to East LA, but my dad was very aware that he was an immigrant. And there was a polarization, especially during the 60s, during the Chicano moratorium, where he did not associate with the word Chicano or Chicana, because at that time, my grandparents were very much like, you are getting your education, go to school. So he did not participate in the walkouts and felt so ostracized by his own community. And so there's, I think, this idea of identity, the boundaries and whatnot. I want to pose this thought to all of us, that I think oftentimes what is unknown and uncertain to us as a human race scares us. And so we want to quickly place and categorize and put a definition around a human being when we're far more expansive in our experiences. And I often find this is what I wrestle with academia, in the need to place a kind of language or a letter, change a label or this or that, or attack or accuse me. Why don't I identify as one way, this way? And I just find that, again, this is, you know, obviously this is history of this kind of conflict, but I think even within my own family, I guess to answer your question, Karen, it was just far more complex than that. So I actually did not grow up calling myself a Chicana or Chicano, because that did not resonate with my parents. And I felt honored to see myself as a Mexicana extension of them, but I'm born here in the US. So it was always really complicated. And then eventually I stumbled upon, yeah, I'm Latina. Cool, that works. And so I've always had an odd relationship to language or what, or a label or a definition. And rather, I'm just like, just call me Sarita. I'm cool with that.
What about you, Alex?
Well, I love what you both have just offered. And Sarita, you stole the thoughts from my head. I feel like so much has to do with how we meet the unfamiliar and the strange and the new. And I think, Karen, I think your play deals with that. I think we both encounter our neighbor, and we at some point, because of the circumstances, we are unable to access curiosity and open-heartedness, and we instead entrench and we get defensive. And both couples, I would say, get into that place of rejecting the unfamiliar, or at least projecting associations. I'll be honest with you, the first thing I did when you pasted that chat in the first comment in the webinar, and I won't have a chance to read it until we sign off, was I Googled history of that phrase, Viva la Raza, because I want to learn now. And I'm grateful to the commenter who put it there, because you're going to start me on a learning journey. So I'm more careful with that language. Latine has entered my vocabulary, and Latinx not so long before. And I have the great pleasure of getting to explain to my abuelos why that term is important. My abuelos are probably not going to fold Latinx into their vocabulary. Like, that's a very difficult word to pronounce for them, you know? But I think, Sarita, your point and your play, Karen, really looks at, like, how do we encounter the unfamiliar? How do we encounter the new and the strange? And how can we breathe and slow down and remain open to learning? Because otherwise, hijinks ensue, to speak diplomatically, I guess.
These have been the best questions I've seen in a long time. They're amazing.
Thank you so much. And this play is so wonderful for sparking these conversations. I'm curious your inspiration behind writing it, and if you intended to have this many layers to it, or if it just came naturally.
I literally, I was at a dinner party and I was like, oh my God, you guys, I have an assignment. I have to write a play. And a neighbor was like, oh, I'm in a terrible fight with my neighbor, and described the fight. And then someone else said, oh no, that's nothing. My mother got stabbed by her neighbor because of, where she put the mail. I mean, it just got absurd and absurd. And I didn't think anything of it. I went home and I was like, wow, it seems like all fights about property. This is in 2014 that I started writing this. All fights about property have something very primal, and it has to do about aesthetic, taste, ownership. Like if you look anywhere around the world, and I said, what happens if I just look at 4 people and look at their how they go, and what can they teach me about how to fight or not fight in many ways. And this kind of actually was going to be a very dark comedy where, the first draft, there was a dog and Frank died, and it got very, very dark. And then I realized it's like, oh, do we need more darkness? And I go, what can this play teach me about how do you hold your own? How do you assert, a different view of the world, but how do you make room for other people? And how do you not end up cutting down the tree despite your nose, right? In a sense. And so I think out of all of my plays, the play that teaches me the most still to this day, because I have a neighbor who was about to cut down her tree next door. And how did I diplomatically kind of deal with, it's her tree, her property, it's, things are falling there, but I love that tree so much. How does it teach me to be a better neighbor? How does it teach me to be a better person? And one of that is realizing what you don't know and what you need to learn, and that walking into a situation with knowing you don't have all the answers is probably the best way to sow new wonderful things. And I mean, the baby, I think, is that thing, like we all have to learn to figure out certain things, not just for us, but for the future, right? And so it really started out as a dinner conversation that ended up becoming a philosophical treatise. And the reason it's not a drama is because I really thought nobody wants to be talked to. I don't have the answers. If it's a comedy, it's already admitting that it doesn't know what all the answers are. And it means that it's disarming, and every different production, people will laugh or not laugh at certain things, and we'll learn from it. So it was a way of having a discussion throughout the country about things. And this was before Trump was president. This was before, even the presidential election. But unfortunately, the roots to that kind of discord, had already been going on for a while. So that's how the play came about, and how it's been for many theaters. The first time they've had Latino actors or Latino director or something like that has been very exciting. And there's actually Sarita. There's Natalie Camunas is doing a podcast of all the Tanyas who they've gotten together to talk about, the pluses and minuses of doing this play. And, does it end too neatly? Does it, believe me, I've heard all the things. And just like when your children turn around and point out your things that you've done wrong, all I can do is listen and hope that the next play, or if I update the script again, that we can address this in a different way. So.
Beautiful, thank you. I'm excited for this podcast. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, so thank you so much. And I do think it's very realistic in a lot of ways too. I know when my mom bought our first house, everyone was telling her, you got to cut down the trees, got to cut down the trees. And she was absolutely not. That's not going to happen. And when my brother came and saw this play this past weekend, his immediate comment to me after was, oh my gosh, Frank and Virginia are like so-and-so, what some neighbors of ours. And so it's really great. I think this play helps facilitate a lot of dialogue. So thank you for offering that. I will check for any more questions if we have time for one more, but other than that, I would like to give a land acknowledgement before we end our call. So there is just a question about the playlist. So if that can be a technical thing that maybe PlayMakers can address. But so thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, everyone. And it's actually Native Plants Week, so that's really cool. And we encourage you to look at native gardening as well as a practice, as well as our show. And so we just want to do this land acknowledgement that we acknowledge we're located on unceded lands of one or more of Abiyala's original sovereign nations, the names of which have not yet been affirmed. The unjust acquisition of these indigenous lands came through a history of racism, violence, dispossession, displacement, and erasure of cultures by settlers as part of the larger land-centered project of settler colonialism. As we look to the future, please join us in acknowledging and learning about the atrocities committed against these nations and work with us towards inclusion, representation, a better relationship with the citizens of sovereign American Indian and Alaska Native nations. And I think as this conversation has shown, is that we're becoming less US-centric when we talk about indigeneity. So of course, we encourage you to look into that as well, and all the indigenous unceded lands in Latin America. Thank you all so much. And if anyone has, Vivian, I see that you're back, if you want to close us out.
Well, I just wanted to say a huge thank you again to this incredible conversation. And I have a feeling that many of the people listening have seen the play, but if you haven't, and otherwise we have another, where are we, week and a half only, up through October 30th. And we want as many people to come see and respond to this show as possible. So we hope you will join us for that. And so deeply appreciative to have this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. This was fantastic. I feel like I took so much away. And there were so many times that this play brings up so many opportunities to have conversations. So hopefully we can continue the conversations.
Thank you all for being playmakers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for this great, robust conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.